Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast for PC, Mac, GameCube, Xbox, and more recently, PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. What you're seeing here is of course the PC version. This is a first and third person shooter and the sequel to Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith. It was developed by Raven Software and published by LucasArts in 2002, first for PC, then later on the same year for Mac, GameCube, and Xbox, and it later saw a re-release on PlayStation 4 and Switch in 2019. Upon its original release, the game was generally quite well received, although it was less well received on the consoles, mainly because of things like the degraded graphics and performance, as well as some control issues here and there, and most notably on the Xbox version, the lack of online multiplayer. But regardless of how the game was received back in the day, what we have available now are the PC version, which will run on just about any system you can possibly imagine these days, and you have the PS4 and Switch versions, both of which, from my understanding, are rather good ports, so worrying about the differences between the various versions of the game isn't really all that productive. What's far more important are the following questions. First, how is this as a follow-up to Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight, and more specifically Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith, especially considering the change in development from in-house at LucasArts to being outsourced to Raven Software? How is it as a first-person and third-person shooter in general? And how does it hold up nearly 20 years later at this point? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on the Quake 3 engine, and it's a prime example of how Raven Software were basically masters of taking id Software's technology and using it in a very effective manner. At the time this released, it was actually a fairly good-looking game. It had rather good texture quality for the time, the modeling was rather good for the time, the animations were rather smooth and fluid, and it even had facial animations, which were admittedly quite simple, but for the time, they were pretty decent. Of course, when you look at it from a modern perspective, it all looks very dated, and the resolution options in-game are entirely 4:3, even though the game is actually capable of running 16:9 resolutions. All you have to do to fix it is go into the config file and find the lines where it has the height and width of the in-game resolution, and just set those to whatever resolution you want to run the game at. And of course it goes without saying that if you had a sufficiently powerful PC back then, and of course these days with much more powerful PCs available, this thing is running buttery smooth at well over 60 frames per second all the time, so you're never going to have to worry about performance issues anymore. So really what it's going to come down to as far as visuals go are personal preference. If you just don't like the graphics of that era, or you don't like older 3D graphics in general, then obviously the graphics really aren't going to do much for you, although it is worth noting that they absolutely nailed the Star Wars aesthetic. And there's even some particularly interesting and nice features to the graphics that really help enhance that, like the scoring marks whenever you use a lightsaber in a confined environment and end up slashing into a wall or something. You'll see the jagged path where your lightsaber cut into that wall. Or of course the dismemberment effects on the enemies, where you'll be swinging your lightsaber around and chopping enemies' hands and such off, which is pretty satisfying. But it's made even more satisfying when you enable saber-realistic combat in the console, and suddenly you find that your lightsaber does exactly what you would expect a lightsaber to actually do, which is just make mincemeat out of your opponents. You're seeing body parts flying all over the place, you're chopping hands, arms, legs, torsos, heads, whatever apart, and it is glorious. So even though the visual quality itself has become rather dated over the years, Raven Software's attention to detail in bringing the Star Wars universe into the Quake 3 engine ultimately means that the visuals actually end up holding up very well overall. And it's a similar story when you move over into the sound design, where they're no longer limited by the poor sound quality issues that they had in the previous games, which were just limited by the tech of their time. This means that as far as the soundtrack goes, you are of course dealing with the classic John Williams Star Wars score, and it all works very well of course, but it's all quite good quality, and when you move over into sound effects and voice acting, you don't end up with any of that grainy sound that you would have had in the previous games to this. Instead, you are dealing with good quality mixing and good quality sound files. But as far as what they do with their newfound sound quality, well, they did a rather good job with it. The explosion sounds are a bit on the weak side, but all of the blasters and weapon sounds, and of course the lightsaber sounds, are all exactly the kind of thing you would expect from a Star Wars game, and they all work very well in the context of the game. And then of course there's the voice acting, which is also quite well done. I mean, this was still a relatively early era for video game voice acting, so you do occasionally have a sour line here and there, and you do occasionally have moments where the voice acting just comes across as a bit cheesy, but the nice thing about this is that it's a Star Wars game, so a level of cheese is expected. All of the principal characters are pretty well voiced, although occasionally they do deliver a sour line or something particularly cheesy here and there. Nothing outside of the realm of what we expect for Star Wars, though. And there's even a couple of characters from the main Star Wars series involved in this, namely Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian. And while they didn't get Mark Hamill to do the voice of Luke in this, they did get Billy D. Williams to do the voice of Lando, and he does a good job.
I can deal with those here, but that doesn't solve the bigger problem. The entrance to the pad is closed, and I don't think they're going to just open it up for us if we ask politely.
So when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that looks and sounds like a proper Star Wars game, and that more than makes up for the explosion sounds being on the weaker side and the overall visuals just being rather dated by modern standards. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is set 2 years after the events of Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith, where Kyle Katarn has given up the ways of the Force and has gone back to just being a mercenary for the New Republic. The game starts off with Kyle and his longtime partner Jan Ors going on a mission to a remote world called Kejim to investigate an Imperial remnant base for Mon Mothma, and after fighting their way through the facility, they find out that the Imperial remnant forces were experimenting on crystals that can store Force energy. And while Kyle's not very keen on getting involved with the Force again, he and Jan do accept another mission to investigate the source of the crystals, and that's when they find another Imperial facility where they have been experimenting on prisoners and have effectively enslaved the locals to mine these crystals for them. After rescuing the prisoners, Kyle finds out that Jan has been captured by a dark Jedi named Desan along with his apprentice Tavion, and with Kyle having renounced the Force, he's effectively powerless against Desan, who throws him around like a ragdoll and then orders Tavion to execute Jan. Now filled with rage, Kyle makes his way back to the Valley of the Jedi in order to basically jumpstart his reconnection to the Force so he can hunt down Desan. But in doing this, he played right into Desan's hands, as Desan and his forces follow Kyle to the valley and then start harnessing the power of the valley for their own ill purposes. Meanwhile, Kyle goes back to the Jedi Temple on Yavin 4 to meet with Luke Skywalker and retrieve his lightsaber. Luke tells him that in order to get his lightsaber, he'll need to pass a series of trials, and that serves as your tutorial for the use of Force powers, and eventually once you get the lightsaber back, also your tutorial for just swinging the lightsaber around, as well as being able to throw the lightsaber. And now that Kyle has both his lightsaber and his connection to the Force again, the rest of the story involves two things. First off, finding out whatever Desan's nefarious plans are and stopping those, and second, tracking down and neutralizing Desan. Along the way, you'll be fighting all manner of scum and villainy, like mercenaries or Imperial remnant, and eventually you'll even be fighting the Reborn, which are what Desan was working towards. They're effectively artificial Dark Jedi, in the sense that they took people and infused them with the power of the Force using these crystals, among other methods, gave them some basic training in the use of a lightsaber, and then unleashed them upon their foes. The idea, of course, being that if you have an army of Dark Jedi instead of just one or two of them, then you're basically unstoppable. And while that's certainly rather cheesy, it's told in a way that makes sense for a Star Wars plot. And in fact, the game is so good at retaining that Star Wars vibe throughout the entire game, it's easy to get lost in what you're doing as opposed to focusing on the problems that the story has. Because cheesiness is part and parcel for the Star Wars franchise as a whole. But The game does have some really nasty pacing issues in particular, where the first several levels of the game just feel like they're dragging on and on and on because you don't have access to the force powers or the lightsaber. But once you do gain access to them, the next level is on Nar Shaddaa, and it's arguably the worst level in the entire game because it introduces the snipers. It's basically like the infamous Sniper Town level in Medal of Honor Allied Assault, except it's made even worse by the fact that you're having to do a bunch of platforming and puzzle solving, and it just gets incredibly irritating. But once you finally get past that, the game starts to really hit its stride, and you'll be treated to a whole lot of, for lack of a better term, Star Wars moments. Rescuing Lando from the clutches of a crime lord and fighting together with him to get back to his ship and escape the smuggler's moon. Fighting side by side with Luke Skywalker against Dasan's forces, and ultimately fighting Dasan himself in one-on-one combat, lightsaber to lightsaber, force powers to force powers. And it's those moments and the attention to detail in recreating the Star Wars look, sound, and feel that ultimately make all of the writing in this game work, even though the dialogue can be a bit cheesy sometimes, and even though the game has some really nasty pacing issues at the beginning. But while that's all well and good if you're a Star Wars fan, the gameplay is what's going to ultimately make or break this for you, regardless of whether you're a Star Wars fan or not. Because that's where things can get really messy, and I'm going to explain more about that in a moment. For now, though, let me go ahead and go over the basic mechanics of the game. Obviously, this is a first-person and third-person shooter. You can swap between the camera perspectives whenever you want, but whenever you use the lightsaber, it defaults to the third-person view, and whenever you use the guns, it defaults to the first-person view. And since this was during that transition period between the old-school style of first-person shooter and the more modern style of first-person shooter, you have a pretty wide selection of weapons, all of which you can carry with you all at the same time. You start off with a stun baton that has infinite ammo and barely does any damage, but eventually that gets replaced with the lightsaber. And you also start with Kyle's classic Briar Blaster pistol, which fires a basic blaster shot with the primary fire and charges up a shot for extra damage with the secondary fire. From there, you'll pick up things like the Imperial E11 blaster rifle, which fires a basic blaster shot with the primary fire and is rapid fire with the secondary fire. And eventually you'll start getting access to weapons like the bowcaster, which functions much like it did in Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, where you have a spread of projectiles that can be charged up with the primary fire, or you can fire a single projectile if you want, or you can shoot out a single projectile that bounces off of walls with the secondary fire, or you'll get access to things like the disruptor rifle, which shoots off a basic blast of energy with the primary fire, but when you go into secondary fire, it pulls up a scope that can be zoomed in depending on how long you hold that button, and then you can charge up a shot that will eventually disintegrate enemies entirely once you get it to maximum charge. You'll also gain access to things like thermal detonators, which function as grenades, where the primary fire will throw a timed grenade and the secondary fire throws one that explodes on impact, and the longer you hold the button, the further you'll throw it. There's a rocket launcher that just shoots out a basic rocket with the primary fire, and the secondary fire shoots homing rockets. There's an Electromagnetic Pulse Gun, which looks an awful lot like the Jawa weapon, which shoots off shocking blasts with the primary fire, and the secondary fire can be charged up to shoot out an area effect attack. There's the Flechette weapon, which shoots out basically a shotgun blast with the primary fire, and the secondary fire shoots out a couple of bouncing grenades. Then rounding out the arsenal, you have detonation packs, which you throw with the primary fire and then detonate with the secondary fire. You have trip mines, which will attach to surfaces and project a laser across the area, and when an enemy moves across that, or you move across it, then the mine will explode. And then you also have the Imperial Heavy Repeater, where the primary fire is basically the game's minigun. It's a very, very fast-firing set of projectiles that don't really do a whole lot of damage individually, but because you can put out a huge volume of fire, it doesn't really matter all that much. And even though it's not very accurate, again, you can put out so many shots that it doesn't really matter. Then the secondary fire lobs out a concussive blast with a relatively short range, but it has an area effect and it is very powerful, so it's very effective even though it doesn't have much range to it. And much like with the previous two Dark Forces games, this one also has shared ammo types between the various weapons. thermal detonators, detonation packs, the rocket launcher, and the trip mines all have their own individual ammo types, but the blaster rifle and blaster pistol both share the same ammo type of blaster packs. The heavy repeater and the flechette gun both share metallic bolt ammunition, and then all of the rest of the guns all share power cell ammunition. Each of these weapons use a different amount of ammo depending on whether you're using primary or secondary fire, and as you would expect from a more old-school first-person shooter, there is no reloading of any kind. You just can shoot to your heart's content. In addition to this selection of weapons, you also have a selection of items you can use, the most useful of which is the Bacta canister, which works in the same way it did in the previous games in the series, where it will heal a small amount of health whenever you use one, and you can carry up to 5 of them at any time. But the other items available to you are the electro-binoculars, which are just binoculars that can be zoomed in depending on how long you hold the button. The light amplification goggles, which are basically the game's equivalent of night vision goggles, where they take on a yellow sheen instead of the green you're used to for most night vision goggles. And unlike with the binoculars, you can use your guns while you have the light amplification goggles equipped. There's the assault sentry, which is a turret you can set down to automatically shoot at enemies that pass by it. And then there is the remote, which you can throw out to follow you around and occasionally shoot at enemies. Like in the previous 2 Dark Forces games, you also have to worry about battery power for a couple of these items, specifically the electro-binoculars, which use a very minimal amount of power while you're using them, but you can eventually run out with them, and the light amplification goggles, which use considerably more power. The thing is, these items have so minimal use in the game that you're not really going to be worrying about that. It's really just a vestigial element from the previous Dark Forces games that they decided to carry over, but they just didn't make good use of it. But speaking of carrying things over, there is also still a non-regenerating health system where you have health and armor, in this particular case shields, and health can be replenished either by using the Bacta canisters or finding medkits scattered around the levels, or eventually, once you gain access to your force powers, using the force heal power. Although until you upgrade that power, it takes quite a while to recharge your health, and you have to stop whatever you're doing in order to recharge that health. As for shields though, there's only 2 ways you can replenish those, either by finding shield pickups scattered around the levels, or by finding shield recharge stations that you can press and hold the action button while you're looking at in order to gradually replenish your shields until eventually that particular device runs out of power. In fact, there's also recharge stations for ammunition as well, although it does not replenish any of your explosive weapons, only your energy-based weapons, and it will gradually replenish them as you continue to hold the action button on them until the recharge station runs out of power as well. Now, all this is all relatively standard stuff for an old-school style first-person shooter, but where things get really interesting are the lightsaber and the force powers. I'll start with the force powers. Now, these start out at level 1, and eventually you will get up to level 3 force powers by the end of the game, and as their power level increases, their capabilities will increase. So, for example, you have force push and force pull, both of which are pretty straightforward, where push will push objects and enemies away from you, and pull will pull them towards you, except that as you continue to improve these powers, you'll find that they affect more targets or wider areas of effect, and in the case of force pull, eventually you'll be able to pull enemies' weapons out of their hands and render them effectively helpless. So force push and pull are 2 of your very basic powers that you'll be using constantly throughout the entire game, whether it be against enemies or even just to solve puzzles. And then rounding out the basic powers are force jump, which is no longer an individual power, instead it's just molded right into the jumping mechanic, where if you just tap the jump button, then you'll do a quick hop, or you'll jump like you did before you had force powers. But if you hold the button down instead, then it will activate the force jump power, and the height of your jump will increase depending on what the level of that power is, and depending on how long you hold the button down. And as a bit of an added bonus, it also allows you to run along walls by jumping towards a wall at the right angle. Then there's the force speed power, which functions very differently than it did in Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight, where it just dramatically increased your actual speed. In Jedi Outcast, it slows the world down around you, and depending on the level of the power, you'll get different amounts of time dilation, from 25% on up to a full 100% of you moving faster than everything else. And the final basic power you get is the Lightsaber Throw, which is the secondary fire on the lightsaber, and it will throw the lightsaber out in front of you and then return to your hand. As the level increases, then your control over it will also increase. and eventually you'll be able to basically hold it out in the air and be able to move it around as if it's more of a telekinetic weapon than just a lightsaber being thrown at an enemy. Then there are the more interesting powers that you unlock a bit later on, like Force Heal, which, as I mentioned, heals you, or the Mind Trick, which will confuse enemies for a brief moment, and eventually you can even use it to basically mind control enemies. And then there are the two destructive powers, which will inevitably bring out your inner Sith Lord, which are Force Grip, where you can choke an enemy, or if you get the more powerful version of it later on, you can actually swing that enemy around and smash them into things or use them as a human shield. And then there's Force Lightning, which doesn't really do a whole lot of damage, but it's very satisfying. And then finally we have the lightsaber itself, where it has seen a considerable overhaul from the way it worked in Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight and of course Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith. The fundamentals are pretty much the same, based on whether you're moving forward, back, left, or right, or a combination thereof. You're going to be swinging the lightsaber in different directions. For example, moving left and pressing the attack button will cause you to swing the lightsaber to the left, or moving right will cause you to swing it to the right. But they also added different directions that you can swing the lightsaber in, so if you're moving forward and to the left, then you will bring the lightsaber down in a left to right downward slash, and vice versa if you're moving forward and to the right. Similarly, if you're moving straight forward, instead of doing the 3-slash attack that you did in the previous game, you will do a basic downward slash, and if you are moving backwards and to the right or to the left, then you'll execute a diagonal upward slash. And if you move around in the right ways, then you can actually combine these into more combination attacks. So you might do a diagonal slash downwards, which moves directly into a slash from left to right, and that moves into a slash from right to left in an upward diagonal motion or something along those lines. And as if that weren't enough of an overhaul, there's also 3 lightsaber styles that you can switch between that will all have different effects. The one you start with is the medium style, which is a very well-rounded attack style, where you have a maximum of 4 attacks in a given combo before you have to start the combo over, and it's a very good combination of speed, damage, and attack range. Then there is the strong style, which is rather slow to attack, but does a ton of damage and can just break straight through the medium style's defenses, but you can only do 3 attacks in combo with that. And then there's the fast style, which actually is a direct counter to the strong style, not just because it's fast and much more agile, but also because it actually has a bit of a defensive bonus against the strong style, and you don't have a restriction on the number of attacks in a combo, but the range of those attacks is much shorter, and it doesn't do very much damage. And of course, the medium style will just break right through the defenses of the fast style as well. And while you'll be carving through stormtroopers and mercenaries and such like they're tissue paper, when you go up against lightsaber-wielding opponents, you'll find that your lightsaber will, of course, bounce off of theirs in a manner that's rather consistent with lightsaber combat. And there are also moments where you'll get into a saber bind with your opponent, and you're basically trying to overpower the opponent by mashing the attack button and also using the correct style to counter whatever they're using. So, for example, if they're using medium, then you want to switch over to the strong style in order to break through that defense much more quickly. And if they're using the fast style, then you want medium. If they're using the strong style, you want the fast style. Lightsabers can even be knocked out of the enemies or your own hands, and that leaves you basically helpless until you retrieve your lightsaber, which is done automatically, but it does take a brief moment to do it, and it can result in some pretty intense lightsaber battles. And because the control methods are so smooth and so intuitive and it all works so well, what you end up with is pretty much the best lightsaber combat we have ever seen in a Star Wars game. And I only say pretty much because Jedi Academy made that system even better. And between the exceptional lightsaber combat and the Force powers, this game does a fantastic job of making you feel like you are a powerful Force user who is walking that narrow line between light and dark. And when it's firing on all cylinders, that is absolutely fantastic. The problem is that the game doesn't always fire on all cylinders, and there are certain aspects of the gameplay that are noticeably weaker than the lightsaber combat and the Force power usage. Most notably, the gunplay never really rises above fairly decent. all of the weapons except for the Disruptor Rifle are projectile-based rather than hit scan, so you do have to lead your targets and actually do some proper aiming, but unless you're getting headshots or using the explosive weapons or the concussion blast from the Imperial repeater, enemies can be a bit damage spongy. And speaking of enemies, the enemy AI is really not all that great. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but it does have a habit of just kind of standing in one place and letting itself get annihilated, or running around kind of like a headless chicken and not really making a whole lot of sense. In addition, the level design can be a bit spotty. Most of the time it's fine, but there are a few levels here and there that are just miserable to play through. Not necessarily because they're especially difficult, but because they're pretty tedious slogs. The level I mentioned earlier where you're going up against all the snipers in Nar Shaddaa is a prime example of that. Or, of course, the opening segments of the game where you don't have access to the force powers or the lightsaber and you're just having to run around and shoot stuff. And of course, because this is a game from 2002, you have to have that one level where you have a stealth section, and if you get detected, the mission ends and you have to start the entire thing over from either your last save or from the very beginning of the level. And while to be fair, those are absolutely terrible in every single game they're in, the fact that this game does have one of those does count against it. But the final thing I'm going to talk about is the game's difficulty. Now, with a lot of old school games, you generally play them on harder difficulty settings. But that's not something you want to do with Jedi Outcast, because playing this thing on any difficulty higher than the normal setting, which is Jedi, is abject misery. You aren't exactly swimming in health packs or shield pickups throughout the entire game to begin with, but because the enemies do so much more damage to you on the higher difficulty settings, those don't go anywhere near as far as they do on even the normal difficulty setting. So you are constantly scraping by on health and shields, and you can go down in a matter of moments. Obviously, the solution to this is simply to not play through the game on anything higher than the normal setting if you want to actually have fun with it, but that is something you definitely need to be made aware of before you start the game up, because otherwise you'll end up in a situation like I did with the playthrough that I was doing for this Redux, where I went into the Jedi Knight difficulty thinking that it was going to be fine, only to hit the point where the game introduces the Shadow Troopers, and because those guys are damage sponges and lightsabers do so much damage to begin with, and enemies do considerably more damage to you on the higher difficulty settings, I simply could not get through that section without cheating. And keep in mind, this is on the hard difficulty setting, the Jedi Knight difficulty. There's a difficulty setting even higher than that called Jedi Master. I shudder to think how miserable that is to play. But here's the thing, despite all of those issues, and they're not insignificant issues, they're not enough to tank the experience. The single-player campaign in Jedi Outcast is very well done and is very much worth playing, well, as long as you don't play it on the hard or very hard difficulties anyway. And as if the solid single-player campaign wasn't enough, this actually had some pretty decent multiplayer as well, although it is relatively simple multiplayer. Several of the modes are exactly what you would expect for a classic first-person shooter in the more arena style, so free-for-all, team deathmatch, capture the flag, stuff like that, but there's also modes that put a bit of a different spin on things, like Holocron Free-for-All, which is free-for-all except that you don't start with force powers like you do in the other modes. Instead, you have to find holocrons scattered around the map that will give you the force power indicated on that holocron. There's also a spin on Capture the Flag called Capture the Ysalamiri, where if you have the flag, which is replaced with an Ysalamiri, then you actually can't use any force powers at all. You can't use the force jump, you can't use force speed, or anything like that. You're just stuck without force powers as long as you have the flag, so it makes it a lot more difficult to run it back to the base. Then there's the Jedi Master mode, which is a sort of spin on free-for-all where everybody's working against each other more or less, except it's divided into one person who has the lightsaber and force powers, and everybody else who doesn't. And whoever is in possession of the lightsaber is the only person who can score points at that time. So everybody who doesn't have the lightsaber is working against the person who has it, and the person with the lightsaber is trying to stay alive as long as possible and get as many kills while they have the lightsaber as possible. And then finally there is the mode that more or less defined both Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy's multiplayer, which is the duel mode. One-on-one, lightsaber versus lightsaber, and if enabled, force powers against force powers. You see, with all of these modes except the ones that are deliberately designed to work with force powers like Holocron FFA and Jedi Master, you can modify the settings so that either the full force powers are available, or force powers are restricted based on which team you're on, so one team would be dark side, one team would be light side, and you would only be able to use the powers for those particular sides. Or you can set it so that the force powers are effectively disabled, except for force jump. Most of the duel servers back in the day for both this and Jedi Academy disabled the force powers except for jump, because that made it much more of an even playing field, thus allowing player skill to really shine a lot more. But even if you're doing that, then you still have to contend with the lightsaber combat in the multiplayer component being a bit off compared to what's in the single player. The hit detection and damage modeling just isn't consistent with what you see in the single player component, and while the reduced overall damage that lightsabers do in multiplayer makes sense given that it is multiplayer, the actual hit detection can be a bit spotty, so sometimes you'll have your lightsaber go straight through somebody and look like it would do a ton of damage, but it doesn't actually do all that much damage, ultimately just resulting in a bit of confusion and making the lightsaber combat in the multiplayer component just not quite as good as the single player. But up until Jedi Academy release, there really wasn't an alternative if you wanted a good lightsaber combat system in multiplayer. The only real other option was Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, which is of course just an absolute mess to try to get running in multiplayer to begin with, but even once you do, you're still dealing with a very clunky system, so much so that it's just not even a contest. Jedi Outcast is leagues ahead of that. And with the overall multiplayer component being rather solid, it managed to keep people playing it even after Jedi Academy came out, in fact, long after it came out. Although with this now being almost 20 years later, it's basically impossible to get into a game of Jedi Outcast at this point. You can still play the offline against bots, and you can still play LAN games, but the online servers are mostly shut down at this point. And while the game did have something of an active modding community and still has a very active fan base to this day, it just never reached the same heights as the Jedi Academy modding community and fan base, and in fact, the Jedi Academy modding community is still going pretty strong. But as for Jedi Outcast, people generally remember it much more for its single-player campaign than anything else, and that single-player campaign is well worth playing through if you're a Star Wars fan, or especially if you're already a fan of Dark Forces 1 or Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2. It may take a while to gain its footing, but once it does, you are going to be treated to a very strong first-person and third-person shooter set in the Star Wars universe, and some of the best lightsaber combat ever put into an action game. And ultimately, I give it a 4 out of 5. Sure, that's a bit less than the original score, which was a 4.5 out of 5, but back when I originally reviewed Jedi Outcast, I hadn't really solidified my score scale yet. I was still working out some of the nuances between some of the scores, and that included the 4 and the 4.5. Now that that's all more solidified, Jedi Outcast now firmly fits within the 4 out of 5 category. Which does mean I'm going to have to go back and revise my score scale video, because back when I made that, I hadn't done a redux of Jedi Outcast, and I still had it as a 4.5 out of 5. Oh well, that's the kind of thing that can happen with these reduxes. And speaking of reduxes, the next redux, as you might expect, is going to be of Jedi Academy, so stay tuned for that in the next week or so whenever it's going to come out. I don't know at the time I'm recording this, but it'll certainly be the next major video I put out after this one. Thanks for watching. If you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.